So the home over my shoulder was built around the turn of the century, 1900. But in 1952, this was the home of a 20-year-old woman named Jada Z Kader. She lived here with her two daughters, 3-year-old Sherrie Ellen and 4-year-old Vicky. And Jada had kind of a rambunctious youth. She was married at 15 to a man who abandoned her just a couple months later. And then she ended up with another man by the name of Dollarhide, with whom she had her two children, Sherrie and Vickie. And they were living here on the evening of January 23rd, 1952. According to Jada, she very seldomly let her kids play outside by themselves, but with their insistence on doing so, she did allow them to play out in front of the house here for a little while on their own. And roughly around 5:30 p.m., her older daughter, 4-year-old Vicky, came running into the house and told her that a man had pulled up on the curb here in a dark sedan. He was an older man with kind of dirty white hair that Vicky said looked really gross, looked like he needed a bath. And he was wearing a blue zip-up suit. And this man got out of his car and approached the girls and asked them to come closer to him, to which Vicky took a step back and managed to evade the man, at which time the man scooped up Sherrie, put her in the car with him, and sped away. So law enforcement is called, and there's an immediate panic, and there had been multiple attempts in this neighborhood for people to abduct children. One boy in particular had been abducted just a few blocks from here by a sex offender, as they were primarily called at the time. And there were at least 2 other kids in the neighborhood that people had tried to abduct and got away, so it wasn't beyond the realm of possibility that, you know, someone would come and scoop up a kid here, even though Sherrie was a little girl, and it had mostly been boys that had been approached. So a massive manhunt begins, and authorities are searching around. They're busting any known sex offenders in the area. They actually arrested 3 on serious suspicion in this case, all of whom were released. So quickly this case was becoming a troublesome one, because it was very frightening. A little girl's been abducted, and as time goes by, there's decreased odds that someone who's been abducted is going to survive. And it's wild to kind of stand here and think, like, she was just playing on this sidewalk right here behind me with his sister, and based on the story that her other sister said, some guy just pulled up to the side of the road and scooped her up. So as said previously, Jada Kader had a few different men in her life, but this man by the name of Dollarhide was the actual father of her 2 children. So there had to be some lingering suspicion. Was this guy responsible? And he had seen his, they never say whether they were married or not. I don't think they were. So he never saw his ex or his 2 children. He hadn't seen them in over a year. And even Jada herself said she doubted that he was the one responsible, especially since Vicky described this guy as an old man. And considering Jada was only 21, I can't assume Dollarhide was more than 30, if that. But still, upon hearing the news of the abduction of one of his daughters and his name coming up in newspapers, within 2 days he was up in Portland saying, "I don't know what happened. I don't know what's going on." And he was never really considered as a possible suspect during that time. He'd lived in Los Angeles. There were no signs that he'd even been in the Portland area before he showed up a couple days after the abduction, so he was never really considered. However, right after he arrived in the city, there was a sudden shift in the case, and it's not really explained in old information about this case exactly how this was brought about, the motivation that made this happen, what made Jada Kader do it. But for whatever reason, she got in touch with police on the evening of January 25th, roughly 48 hours after Sherrie had gone missing. And she wanted them to accompany her to a location that I'm now approaching, which is roughly along 9th, a little south of Division Street. So I'm now standing along Southeast 9th Avenue right here as it turns, and Division Street's just about a block north, and it's just this very, very industrial kind of factory-laden area, which a lot of this was like that back in the 1950s. It really wasn't that long ago. So this area directly behind me, this was property that was owned by the Portland Gas and Coke Company. So there used to be a lot more stuff here. And Jada Kader brought authorities to this site. We're about, I'd say, 5 blocks south, more west, but southwest from the Kader home. In fact, I can see a little gray building over here, and literally the Kader home would be just like 1 block directly past that. So she brought authorities here, and she led them up to what was called a sump hole that had been dug out on this property. And essentially a sump hole, it's pretty easy to describe. It's something you dig up, and it's just a hole for like runoff water to go into. Like sometimes people, like the really old house I lived in with my parents, that had a sump hole literally in the basement. The concrete floor had a hole cut into it with a water pump put into it. So we had a sump hole in my basement. So that was really all it was, except being for a company like this, it was a good-sized hole, and it went about 20 feet deep, you know, filled up part way with a lot of muddy water, and there was a door over it. So Jada leads authorities to the site of that sump hole, which could have been, you know, on that side of the property. It could have been right here. I'm not exactly sure in relation to the property exactly where it was, but she apparently walked up to the sump hole and very emotionally pointed at it and screamed, "There it is." And authorities lifted the lid off the sump hole, which that lid had probably not been lifted in recent days, and they discovered the body of Sherrie Kader, dead from, it was deemed she died of asphyxiation, and she was just floating around in the water down there. One of the officers who discovered her described it as like, it looked like there was just a doll, a baby doll, bobbing around in the water. So the issue then is, if Jada Kader knew exactly where her daughter was, how did she know that? What happened? Well, according to Jada, the whole story was a farce, that a man had come along and scooped up his daughter. She probably got the idea for that because that was happening in this neighborhood. But by her account, the children were not actually playing on the sidewalk right here. They were actually playing inside the house down in the basement. They were playing, you know, little kids games, 3- and 4-year-old kids. At which time, Jada heard a scream and quickly ran downstairs and discovered Sherrie crumpled up on the floor. And as she perceived it, somehow, whatever the circumstances, Vicky had gotten her hands on a piece of concrete and had dropped it onto Sherrie, and there she was, just crumpled on the ground. So Vicky had actually accidentally killed Sherrie, and Jada obviously was fearful of what could come as a result of that, so she fabricated the story and told Vicky, you know, if anybody asks you, you say someone came along and kidnapped your sister, and that's exactly what she told authorities. But in reality, as Jada now tells it, it was an accidental death. And essentially what she said was she was fearful that under the circumstances, Vicky would be taken away from her and put into a reform school. Now, Jada Kader had herself been put into a reform school. St. Rose School for Girls. It actually still exists in North Portland on Deacom Street. It's actually a really beautiful building. I don't know how beautiful the conditions were that went on in there at this time, but when Jada was a teenager, which she was 21 at this point, so it wasn't that long ago, she had disappeared from home. And when she was found later, she claimed that she was kidnapped. It was a very similar story to the one she initially told about what happened to her daughter here on the sidewalk. It was later found out that that was a complete and total fabrication, and Jada had in fact run off with a friend of hers, and they had engaged in some like petty crime around town. And so she said that she was covering for her daughter because she feared that she would end up in a reform school like she did, even though her daughter was only 4 years old. But again, it's the 50s. I don't really know exactly how people took this. So Jada said that she initially took Sherrie's body upstairs and then pushed it downstairs to make it look like she fell, like that was how she died. She then rescinded that part of her story and kind of just stuck with the general idea that Vicky had accidentally dropped a piece of concrete on her head. And she said that, you know, again, in the fear and wanting to protect her daughter, she took Sherrie upstairs. She waited for nightfall, and she borrowed someone's car. And, you know, at nighttime, got in the car on the street here and began going this direction that I'm now walking. This is west on Ivon Street towards 12th and Ivon. And this building looks old enough. This building was probably here. So she would have come to the end of Ivon Street to 12th, which is this crossing street. And based on where Sherrie was found, she would have taken a turn south and gone this direction, where, you know, we have the Max lines coming through here, which obviously weren't around in the 1950s. But Sherrie's body was found just a little ways this direction. So she no doubt would have traveled this way. Yep. And then you go right around this building. We're only about 2 blocks from the Kader home. And the location where Sherrie's body was found would be right over there. Just a couple blocks. So, you know, the configuration of all these streets would have been a little bit different because the Max tracks wouldn't have been here. Everything would have been a little bit different, but she would have come from this direction, pulled up to this property, and deposited Sherrie's body into the sump hole. That was her explanation for why the initial story she gave about an abduction was wrong, but also how she knew exactly where Sherrie was, because under her story, she said she put her there as a way to protect her younger daughter. So it was a mother doing whatever she could for the one child she had that at this point was still alive. However, Jada was, I don't know if she was very erratic or she just didn't know what she was doing. It seemed like she was a very kind of reckless, very, very self-centered individual. And, you know, she kind of ran wild when she was younger, and then she kind of had to calm down going into her 20s and settle into motherhood. And so, you know, she had the initial story of the abduction, which she then replaced with this story about Vicky accidentally dropping a piece of concrete on her sister's head. She then added this little bit about how she rolled her down the stairs to make it look like she accidentally fell down the stairs, but then took that out of her story and went back to the other one. She then, at one point, tried to implicate her stepfather, a man named Eugene Singh. Now, Eugene Singh and Jada's mother, they also lived in the house at 13th and Ivon. So she implicated him, and she implicated him a few different ways. She implicated him as also like accidentally being involved in it. Like maybe he was down in the basement with Sherrie and Vicky, and he also was implicated with Vicky. And it was like she was maybe trying to pass the buck onto him since he was an adult, maybe, you know. And I don't know, maybe she didn't like her stepdad that much, because her stepdad denied any, you know, connection to any of this, and there's nothing to suggest he was connected to it. But then she even shifted that part of her story to pretty much just say that he alone was responsible and he just killed her. That he was the one responsible for everything that had happened. That he had actually killed her and brought her body to the sump hole out here and deposited her body here. So Jada Kader was really erratic about the details she was giving, and she was just it was like she was making stuff up. It was like she didn't know how to keep her story straight. But what was really important is, in the original story of abduction, Vicky was the only witness to what had happened. So if the story changes and Vicky accidentally dropped a piece of concrete on her sister's head and that's how her sister died, the police still have to get to the bottom of this. They need to talk to Vicky and hear her side of the story. And when they initially approach Vicky to try to get the full story from her, Vicky tells them, well, my mom told me not to talk to police. So that cut that off right here. So authorities knew that they had to somehow get Vicky by herself, where she wouldn't be under the influence of her mother, who was close by, and they were able to effectively do that. So they wanted to see if this story, this new story that Jada was telling about this accidental death and bringing her down to the sump hole, to see if that carried water with the only real witness to Sherrie's murder. So Vicky came down to this property and was led to the location of the sump hole where Sherrie's body had been found. And authorities just wanted her, they wanted to know what she had to say. Did she vindicate her mom's story or not? Did something else happen? Was her mom leaving out details? And when they arrive here, Vicky looks around and she begins to open up. And she tells the officers that she's with that on the night of January 23rd, when Sherrie died, that her mother brought both her and Sherrie all the way down here. And she watched as Jada put her hand up over Sherrie's mouth and nose and proceeded to suffocate her. And as Vicky put it, she kept her hand like that, firmly over Sherrie's mouth and nose, until Sherrie stopped wiggling, stopped struggling, and just went completely limp. At which time Jada lifted the lid and threw Sherrie's body down in there. So by Vicky's account, Jada, with malice and for no real discernible reason, brought them down here and in front of her 4-year-old daughter proceeded to kill the other one. And after Vicky told that story, she took a moment, exhaled deeply, and then simply said, "I've told the truth today." And she never took back that story, even though it directly implicated her mother as intentionally murdering her little sister. And, you know, it made sense because Jada Kader could not keep her story straight. And, you know, authorities brought Vicky back home and confronted Jada with this new story. And of course, Jada did what anyone in those circumstances, guilty or innocent, would do, which was she started breaking down, how could you say this? How could you say these things to the police about your own mother? And then, you know, Vicky started crying and you know, it was a real emotional situation. But Vicky never took that story back, never changed it. And she said, you know, my mom told me to tell you that some old dirty guy had come along and kidnapped my sister, but that wasn't true. And when they finally got Vicky alone, she told them what, as far as we know, really happened, which was that Jada Kader just intentionally and brutally murdered her own daughter. And it's astonishing to me. It's such a disgusting, despicable crime, and it really surprises me that this case is not more well known in the annals of just horrid, debaucherous murders that have happened in Portland or in Oregon as a whole. I didn't know this case existed. I stumbled on it by chance looking up old newspaper articles. It's a somewhat obscure case, and it kind of surprises me that it is. And I just think, you know, one of the most notorious crimes in Oregon history was a woman named Diane Downs, who in 1983 shot her children. She tried to, and it was very similar. I think one of her children died. But yeah, she tried to, she shot and tried to kill all of her children. And she claimed that, you know, it was some mysterious carjacker was actually responsible. And it was found out that that was a lie, that she was in fact responsible. And it became this big story. And granted, it was in the 80s. There was a lot more media. It was a lot more recent. I can understand why it would be more well known. But considering that's one of the most notorious and sick crimes in the history of Oregon. You think, here's Jada Kader, who a little over 30 years earlier, according to one of her daughters, took her 3-year-old daughter down to this area and literally suffocated her. I mean, when they pulled Sherrie out of the water, she had bruising all over her nose and mouth from how hard she had been choked out. It was just a sick and disgusting crime. And yet you practically never hear about the Jada Kader case. But Diane Downs, I mean, you still hear, even today, almost 40 years later, you still hear about it all the time. And really, I mean, you know, considering the circumstances and what happened, Jada Kader was kind of, I mean, she wasn't the first woman in the history of like Oregon to kill or try to kill her children, but she really was kind of Diane Downs before Diane Downs came along. In fact, I think Diane Downs was born within a year of this case happening. But the following day, after Vicky's claims, it was January 26th, been only 3 days, Jada was arrested and charged with the murder of her daughter. And to this day, I've never been able to find, and of course, Jada, you know, even when this case went to trial, she still, even after all the inconsistencies in what her daughter had to say, she still maintained the story of the concrete. You know, Vicky dropped concrete accidentally on her sister's head, and that's why she died. And to the defense's luck, because Vicky was so young and considering the circumstances, and everybody felt really sorry for her that she'd already had to endure so much in relation to this case, she was deemed, they decided she wasn't going to be allowed to testify at the trial, which is kind of important since she was the key witness there, but she was still a little 4-year-old girl who had watched her mom in person murder her sister and then say, oh, we're going to say somebody else did this. Just truly disgusting. But, you know, because Jada still wouldn't admit to being responsible, it's one of these things where we never really got much of an explanation. We never got a motive for why she did it. And if you really put me into a situation where I had to guess what happened, I would probably guess that Jada tried killing her daughter. I want to think that she would have done it because she wanted her freedom back. That was kind of what people felt was the case with Diane Downs, is she wanted to be free of motherhood. But she only killed one of her children. What was she maybe considering? Killing one child and then waiting a while and killing Vicky too and trying to make it look like 2 mysterious murders happened? We'll never know, because she never had the opportunity to do anything like that. But it did really seem that Jada Kader, and she's only 21 at this time, she's still young, but she was a very rebellious and kind of reckless youth who it seemed very much wanted to do whatever she wanted. She didn't seem to be a very responsible person. She didn't really seem to care that much. You know, again, she said there it is when she directed authorities to where her daughter was. She would, you know, sit and just smoke her cigarettes while all this stuff was going on. And it was just, she didn't really look like she cared that much about this whole affair. And so I kind of get vibes that she really was just trying to, again, I mean, if I had to make a guess, I really don't know. I would guess that she was trying to put herself in a position where she had less motherly responsibility in her life. And something that's interesting, now, he could have said this because he was pissed because she tried to get him implicated in all this, but Jada's stepdad, Eugene Singh, who she said briefly was like responsible, he said that he always felt that Jada showed obvious preference to Vicky over Sherrie. Like, she loved her more. So, I don't know. None of us know. That would just be my guess. But whatever the case, in the end, it was, because they wanted, like, this is the murder of a child. They wanted, the stiffest of charges. And unfortunately, it didn't really look like that was going to happen. One of the key things, again, is Vicky was not allowed to testify. And Vicky was the one who said, Vicky was the only witness there besides Jada. And she was a little girl. And she was the only one to say that Jada had done this. Now, everyone kind of wholeheartedly believed what Vicky had to say, but she couldn't be there at the trial to say so. And, there was so much conviction with Jada's story, and I think, it's the 1950s, and it's always been hard for society to accept the notion of a mother. The mothers give birth to the children, and it's always hard for people to believe that a mother could be responsible for killing her own child. And I think a lot of those things played into it. So she ended up getting charged in the end with manslaughter and given a maximum 15-year sentence and a $1,000 fine on top of it. I don't really know. Might as well just give her 16 years and no fine. So if she was responsible, she definitely got off light, because she would have been in her mid-30s by the time, and that's if she served a max sentence. And I couldn't really find any more information about her after the trial. I found like one article that stipulated she tried to have the trial like thrown out based on a bunch of stuff, and the judge threw that out. So I don't know exactly when she got out of prison. I don't know how long she lived. I don't know what she did after she got out of prison, because she would have been about 36 even if she served her whole sentence. So I really don't know what happened to her after that. She just kind of faded away, as was probably best for everyone involved. Especially if I believe Vicky's story. I think Jada was responsible. She didn't look like she bore a lot of moralistic qualities. And as I say that, and as I reflect, I've done a full circle, and I'm walking past the home here again. This little green place surrounded by all the bamboo. And right there on that little sidewalk in front of it was where we were all led to believe these little girls were just playing and having a good time, when some sicko pulled up in a car and grabbed one of them. And it was all just a big lie. The whole thing was really just a big lie. It seems like the only person that wasn't making something up in all this, well, actually, never mind, Jada was the only one making up stuff. But yeah, that's the story as I know it, as far as this horrid murder of Sherrie Ellen Kader, as she was stated in the newspapers, at the hands of her mother. Just horrid, frightening, nauseating, all of the above. So all that said, thank you so much for joining me today. I know if some of these stories are hard to stomach, and this is definitely one of them. And but it's a story that deserves to be told, and it's a story that deserves to be remembered, if for nothing else, the sickness of it all, and the fact that stuff like this should not be allowed to happen. People certainly shouldn't be getting 15-year sentences for it. They should be punished much more severely than that. And if it's an important story and it hits me really hard, whether it's in a happy way or a sad way, I want to bring those stories. And that's one of the reasons I brought this one to you today from Southeast Portland. So all that said, remember as always to like, share, subscribe, hit up my Patreon. I'm always posting new stuff there for you that you can only see if you join my Patreon today. The link to that is in the description, with my Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and Reddit subreddit pages. And all that said, from 12th and Division, as I'm approaching near where all this craziness happened, it's been Steve the Amateur Historian, and I'll see you next time.